this course on Illumination Engineering and Electric Utility Services. Today we take up the 15th lesson titled Interior Lighting. Having understood the need for artificial lighting, having looked at various artificial sources of lighting, the ways to measure and how to control the light on the objects, it's time we had an overall look at how these artificial lights can be employed. The instructional objectives for this lesson would be: the first one, list the factors that are responsible for interior lighting. We are talking about the interior lighting. In fact, today most of the times when you are working indoors, there may be need to illuminate using artificial sources even during day, and that is where it becomes necessary. 2, state recommended requirements for good lighting. 3, the various factors that govern the light output in case of interior illumination. So, 4, state the maintenance procedures for proper interior lighting. Needless to mention that any system which may be used for the benefit of humanity needs certain maintenance procedure. So, this objective essentially looks at understanding the maintenance procedures that are necessary for proper interior lighting, and lastly enumerate recommended illuminance levels. Obviously, the eye is the organ that enables us to perceive the information from the external world more than 80%, and that's to facilitate that we are having illumination sources which try to emulate as close as possible to the natural light. So, there are certain illuminance levels. So, coming to interior lighting, the lighting that is required for interiors inside a building, could be inside a hospital, school, working interiors, any building we may take has some form of artificial lighting to make it usable for the purpose which it is. Therefore, it is a very complex problem. The lighting indoors is a real complex problem. It has varying factors depending on the purpose of service. For instance, inside a temple where the meditation is being done, the requirement of lighting levels could be different compared to a factory shop floor where precision components are being soldered onto a PCB. Therefore, if one of the first factors that may be necessary is the service for which the interiors are being used, then the problem comes in terms of class of interiors, that is type of interiors, type of furnishings, type of walls, the openings and occupancy level. Then is the necessity of looking at the luminaires. Now, depending on the height of the building or the interior, one can look at, and based on the application, let us recall that a point source of light essentially has illuminance reducing inversely as 1 over the distance square, whereas if you had a line source of light, it reduces inversely as the distance. On the other hand, a sheet of light has independent of the distance. So, depending on the requirement, one may have to have a luminaire which can accommodate the lamps to produce the required effect. And then of course color effect, color rendering, in fact in the last lecture we saw, is a very important issue which tries that in the presence of this light it makes the object appear as natural as it is in the natural light. Then comes the issue of how much of light is used, how much is wasted. This is where the interior surfaces come into picture. The moment we say interior, we have walls, ceiling, floor. So, where the light is absorbed, where the light is reflected, and how it is reflected. And in fact, one other issue which becomes very crucial and one of the common mistakes in a lighting design is glare, and that can arise from the reflections. If proper reflection factors are not chosen and the colors of the furnishings vis-a-vis the walls are not matched. These are some of the issues one needs to keep in mind. What constitutes a good lighting? That is a very important issue. Having said that there are so many factors which decide the kind of a lighting which we will have for the interiors, let us see what constitutes a good lighting. Good lighting should have intensity which will make us see clearly and distinctly. Let us say we are talking of lighting a classroom. What is the purpose of the classroom? Purpose of the classroom is for students to learn. So, they should be able to clearly see the blackboard there and observe what the lecturer is writing on the board. So, the intensity should be designed in such a way it is enough to create clear and distinct images and of the objects that need to be seen. Distribution of light again should be uniform. In fact, that is why you find that in good lighting installations it is never a single lamp in a large room. It is a number of lamps so positioned that at least due to one particular lamp you get a uniform over a part of the room. So, distribution is the second important aspect which constitutes good lighting. And obviously the diffusers are used to make light not to hurt the eyes of the observer and make it soft, and therefore diffusion is the third important aspect of good lighting. The color per se depends on purpose and taste. Remember that there are certain applications where clear observation of color may not be necessary. When you are trying to distinguish, say, the conductors in an electrical circuit, often we use a color code which connotes the green is the earth conductor, red is the phase conductor, black is the neutral conductor, and the illumination in the room, if it is not able to distinguish between them in a laboratory, it is no use. On the other hand, when you are just relaxing to listening to music, the color of the objects in the vicinity does not matter. However, the approach would be to have as close to daylight, and in fact which has a peak around yellowish region, to have yellow. And we said glare is one of the common mistakes. And how does it occur? It occurs by virtue of presence of bright source of light in the line of vision. Therefore, preferably the lamps are to be located well above range of vision. So, these are the factors which constitute good lighting. One has to keep these in mind. And the brightness of a lamp of course is reduced by providing diffused glassware. We have those spherical shells which are diffuse or oval cells which we have seen, and always avoid having objects which can give specular reflection in the range of vision. One other issue which is very important is that when we are observing objects, we are observing objects in 3 dimensions. We need to have an idea of the depth, and one of the important ways to perceive depth or accentuate depth is through shadows. So, the shadows selectively have to be included. They should be there, but not apparent abruptly, or they are not supposed to be very dense, not harsh, and they are toned down, that is mild shadows are required. Therefore, a standard lighting in an interior domain would consist having 2 schemes. One, a general lighting for the entire arena which is comfortable to the eye and enables free movement of the people around, and a local lighting depending on the task specific. And always by having this, it eliminates dark shadows and also enables there is a certain abrupt change in contrast between 2 objects. And of course, there are certain applications where certain parts should be shown. You are talking about a lecture theatre, the emphasis should be on looking at what is on the screen. Or if you go to a shopping mall, there will be a display window. The items placed in the window need to be emphasized, and therefore lighting should be in such a way that emphasizes the parts that need to be shown. Hence, we recommend that sources be located keeping the visual importance of the object. For instance, you need a lamp placed right above the blackboard in a classroom, so that the students are able to see what is written on the board. This is often achieved through the process of what we call concealed lights. We have seen lamps located in the recess of the ceiling, or counter lighted, that is in order to avoid strong shadows, the light placed on the 2 opposite sides of an object enables eliminating unwanted shadows. And at the same time, unless the lamp itself is archival or in nature, or it's got attention to be drawn to it as a form of an antique, it should have a low attention value. Like as I said, in a reading room, what needs to be felt is the reader should be able to read or write on the desk, but he should not be distracted by the lamp. So, the source itself should have very low attention value. And glare, of course, we had a complete lecture on glare where we talked about what constitutes glare, which is essentially intense bright light in the line of vision, and this should be resisted, and this is the common source of mistake in what you call most of the lighting installations. Before we proceed further, it would be appropriate to look at some of the recommendations made for good illumination pertaining to interiors. These recommendations are taken from the as suggested by American Institute of Architects. Let us see one by one. The first recommendation deals with general lighting. It says general lighting is one which illuminates all the objects and areas within an interior, keeping in mind relative importance. Okay. So, what is the general lighting? It is a lighting which illuminates complete interiors, keeping in mind relative importance of the various activities within that interior. It has to be at a level which is comfortable to the eye throughout the room, eliminating dark shadows and avoiding sharp contrast. We have already said there should not be abrupt change in contrast. In fact, we will see the trend is from the brightest object to the darkest object, there is a particular recommended ratio of brightness which is between 10 to 1. This ensures that there are no sharp contrasts and dark shadows are eliminated. You of course must have soft shadows or mild shadows which helps you in accentuating depth or trying to know the three-dimensional aspect of the object that is being observed. Roundness of the object is a must, and the lighting must emphasize only the object that needs first attention. So, the relative brightness must be in such a way that the observer is drawn to that object which needs to be. In fact, if you go to a shopping arena, the showcase or showroom windows, I mean where they show the new products, the most recent product gets highlighted more than the others, so that the buyer gets attracted to the recent item or the new arrival. So, the first recommendation deals with general lighting, which says it should illuminate all areas, keeping in mind the relative importance of the various parts at a comfortable level, eliminating dark shadows and sharp contrasts, keeping sharp shadows so that you are able to perceive the depth, and emphasizing only on those parts that need first attention. The second recommendation is to do with light sources. We said light sources should never draw attention to themselves. Light sources should be subordinated in visual importance to the things intended to illuminate. There may be rare exception when the light could be a decorative element, it could be antique, then it is to be emphasized. Unless concealed or counter light, they are not apparent, they have extremely high attention value and dominate the scape. So, otherwise if they are located, if they are not concealed, they are not counter lighted, they should be located in such a way that the observer is not drawn to the lamp, but he is drawn to the object which is lit by the light coming from this source. So, essentially what it means is you should not get distracted by the way the lamp is located. One simple thumb rule would be, because most common way of locating lamps is suspending from the ceiling. Let them be suspended at a height which is well above the line of vision. So, unless a person observer directs his head towards the ceiling, he is not disturbed by these lamps. The third one is to do with glare. I said, though the recommendations talk about glare, it is the common error in most lighting schemes. It must be eliminated and results out of the intense bright light within the line of vision. This is more so, the higher the candle power of the lamp, higher is the scope for glare. In fact, this is where diffused glare helps in reducing this, and instead of locating the point sources, you have large number of sources distributed, trying to come as close to as possible as a sheet of light. So, this also arises in the form of reflections from polished surface and arises more from the design where contrast between light and shade is very large. So, this is where diffusers have to be adapted, and the entire room interiors including the furniture have to be designed with what we call diffusing or absorbing materials rather than reflecting materials. So, if you see the most of the walls are not made highly reflecting. We will come to the typical recommended reflectance levels we have seen earlier also in talking about the glare reduction. So, the first one was to do with how a general lighting should be. The second one talked about how the light should not, or the lamp should not draw attention to itself, and the third talks about the glare control, and needless, the fourth recommendation talks about the illumination level. So, depending on the type of service, the illumination level needs to be adequate for the type of eye work. In fact, we talked about these levels when discussing about the functioning of the eye, and there we did mention the comfortable levels in terms of illuminance for various applications. And this is where it also says a local lighting is to be supplemented with general lighting. One may question, why have two sets of lights? As already told, in order to avoid abrupt change in contrast, it is necessary that there is some general lighting in any interior to create ease of movement, and that is as per the recommendation number 1. Now, this illumination should be adequate depending on the nature of the work, for working at the machines, working at the desks, reading tables. If you are just watching a film with visuals, there may not be requirement of large illumination. On the other hand, if you had to read fine print, or one has to work at assembly line trying to assemble precision parts, there is a need for more intense illumination. So, its local lighting is invariably a high level, and as already told, is always to be accompanied by general lighting. This avoids an eye strain and minimize controls. This is very important, otherwise it becomes very difficult. And if glare is avoided, there will be no over illumination. Keeping this in mind, the sort of upper limit which can be put, here we are though talking about indoor illumination, we are suggesting certain maximum that may be there in outdoor conditions. Remember, in outdoor conditions it is all open and there is ample scope of light being lost by way of absorption into the atmosphere. So, we find that the recommendation is around 10,000 foot candle as the maxima for an outdoor application, whereas it is 100 foot candle for indoor. So, this is the thing. So, we talk, this is the sort of a upper limit which we get. This level we say it should be adequate for eye task. The general lighting, as already brought out, is related and it is controlled. In fact, there is no control for the local lighting, it is an intense light of required level for that particular task. General lighting can have illumination level altered depending on the mood. Now, here we have grouped the applications into different groups. The first group which we are looking at is what that requires very low levels. It could be for say worship, meditation, introspection. In fact, this is a situation where one does not really observe what is there or what is moving. The light should be adequate enough to warn of the observer about the way to go out or come into the room and see if there is any disturbance. So, very low levels are adequate enough. In fact, the meditation which they say is calls for completely shutting off any inputs to the mind through the eyes. On the other hand, the physical activity, mental activity, gaiety, we see the dance clubs, disco clubs, physical activity, playing. When you are playing, let us say you are playing badminton, you need to know how the shuttle is moving. Compared to the players, the size of the shuttlecock is very small. Smaller the object, the more light is required to track its movement. Faster it is, you need more light, slower it is, lesser light will do. So, all these come under a group which involves certain intense activity. For instance, intense reading and writing, working on these are all involving precision eye tasks which needs for high levels. Now, there are certain third group which comes between the two. So, we have seen on one hand we have worship, meditation, introspection which needs very low levels, whereas the intense activity involving physical or mental activity or gaiety involving high levels. The third group is where theatres, homes, restaurants. Homes, depending on the nature of activity, the room could be lit with low or high. The various ways to do would be to use dimmers. We talked about dimmers which essentially control the voltage input. This holds good if you are using incandescent lamps. Otherwise, you could have discharge lamps with different elements, low wattage elements and high wattage elements. Depending on the mood, you could. Restaurants is again a place where, depending on the mood, the light levels can be adjusted. As opposed to this, you have commercial sector involving shops. Shops would have varying levels and they need to light in such a way that the customer is attracted to the object that the shop wants to sell. Now, depending on the, in fact, we said the new arrival should have an illumination in such a way that it draws first attention when the customer enters. In fact, that is why the recommendation says it should be appropriate to woo customers through psychological reaction. That means, by very its appearance, it should make the buyer think of buying it. Now, the last group which we have listed here consists of offices, factories, schools. All these are working towards efficient production of certain product, and efficiency depends on making the working conditions as comfortable for the people concerned as possible. And in all these environments, there is intense activity involving precision use of eyes. So, this is where one has to have illumination which causes least eye strain. Lastly, it is necessary to match the sources with the interior, walls, ceiling, the style, and considering the architectural nature of shape, finish and other issues. With all this, we said in a particular interior there can be dark corners, bright corners, and the general recommendation talks about a general illumination level which is comfortable for the eyes and keeps these things in mind. With all this, the trend would be that if you have a task, let us say we take a classroom, the task there would be to work based on the subject being taught. So, the reading and writing is the basic task. So, the brightest surface in the room should not be more than 3 to 4 times brightness of the task in question, and in a similar way the task brightness should not be more than 3 to 4 times darkest surface. What does this lead to? I told you there should be a relationship between the darkest object, brightest object and the task. So, the brightness ratio which is believed to give rise to this kind of a thing would be 10:3:1. So, when you have a mix of general lighting vis-a-vis the task lighting or the local light source at the point where the source is located could be viewed as the brightest surface, and the farthest point from the general light source could possibly be the darkest. So, they should have a ratio of 10:3:1. But all this should be done eliminating glare, which will result in good visibility and enables easy viewing, and as a whole produces a pleasing psychological effect, which enables the observer or the user to effectively function for the purpose for which he is or she is using that particular interior. Now, all this says that in fact for general lighting would call for large light sources which cover entire ceiling. In fact, in many offices we do find the large luminaires are used, in which the number of fluorescent lamps are placed. They are so spaced in such a way that the surface simulates as close to a complete sheet. Thereby, it results a uniform good general lighting. The other way to achieve this is, which is most of our houses in fact have, we call it white paint. The ceiling is painted white, we use whitewash we call it, and then you have semi indirect luminaires. The light from this lamp is directed through a reflector onto the ceiling, and the ceiling reflects the light onto the objects below where you have the workforce. In fact, this is also achieved by having a false ceiling which is white or off white with a translucent diffusing material placed on which number of lamps are located. No doubt all this involves complex wiring. And now if you look at the, apart from the glare, another defect is to use very bright luminaires with dark floors and dark furniture. This is where it is going to create. Recall the ratio which we have suggested between the darkest to the brightest should be between 10:3:1. That is, if you have light color interiors and large sources, that is having line or sheet sources of low brightness, you can get a good uniform illumination all over. In fact, the one issue which comes is daylight illumination, especially when you are using in interiors. How do we allow daylight to come in? We have windows. In fact, if we are able to suitably locate our windows and get the daylight, there will be tremendous energy saving too. However, the illumination due to natural illumination changes with weather, season, time of the day, and as you go higher and you find that the lower daylight levels on the upper levels. So, it is observed that around 20 to 25 feet from the window, the daylight essentially falls. So, the window height has to be kept in mind, keeping in view whether the windows are located are possible to locate on both the walls, opposite walls, and the width of the room. Then second thing is, whenever the illuminance level falls below 10 lux at any point on the surface. In fact, if you see, if you have a room with windows only on one side, you can find that the point on the floor closer to the other wall would have the minimum illuminance, but if you had windows on either side, it would be the midpoint which has the minimum illuminance, and whenever it falls below that, there is a need to turn on the general lighting. Now, this is one thing which you can take care. In fact, sometimes we do not allow the windows to be used in an open mode. We partially screen them so that you have uniform general lighting independent of the time of the day. That is what is the common practice. So, in order to have the good illuminance due to the daylight, the top of the window should be as close to the ceiling as possible. Thereby, it enables controlling light to the deepest end of the room. So, this is one thing. So, you have as close to the ceiling as possible. In fact, one guideline which is followed is that the height to the top of the window should not be less than half the depth of the room. So, if the depth of the room is 10 feet, height to top window should not be less than 5 feet. That is the index. And the window opening is one source of what you call the glare area, the bright sunlight coming. This should be around 1/5 the floor space. If you have a floor space of 10 feet by 10 feet, 100 square feet, it should be around 20 feet. So, this is the guideline in arriving at the. Then, as already told, to have nearly uniform brightness independent of the daylight conditions, one could have a mix of partially screened things by using shades, baffles, lower diffusers, so that there is no glare whatsoever, and making the top of the window as close to the ceiling as possible. This is done. Let us say if the artificial illuminance that may be sufficient for the task is X, the minimum illuminance what one should expect from the daylight should be 2x. So, if that be the case, if one has windows located only on one wall, it is width of the room should be less than 2 times height to the top of the window. So, width of the room should be less than 2 times height to top of the window. Let us say top of the window is located at 5 feet, 2 times that is 10 feet. So, the room width should be around 8 feet. On the other hand, if the windows are located on opposite walls, the width between the walls should not be greater than 6 times the height to top of the window. Going by the same argument, if the top of the window is around 5 feet, 6 times that would mean 30 feet. So, it should be less than 30 feet between the 2 walls. These are some of the guidelines. Having said all this, the next thing that comes is the location of the lamps. That depends on the candle power, the maximum allowable spacing between the lamps, the height at which to be located. Remember, too large a spacing would involve what is called dark shadows or dark spaces between. Remember, the aim is to have as uniform lighting as possible. Lamps best fitted closer to the ceiling, and that way they are clear of obstructions, and they could be suspended, mounted at the surface, or could be recessed in the ceiling. Most of the tasks which are intense visual acuity are on tables like reading and writing, which may be typically about 1.2 meters above the floor. They can have local lighting in addition with low hanging lights. But keep in mind, when multiple lamps are there, spacing should never be more than the height of the mounting. Consider the two rooms, one 20 feet by 50 feet by 10 feet, other 40 feet by 100 feet by 20 feet. In fact, with number of lamps located with same center to center distance of 10 feet, you find this, the number of lamps remaining same. The smaller room would need a 100-watt lamp, whereas the larger room would need a 400-watt lamp. This shows a typical small room, and in fact you find the way it is marked. This is that 20 feet by 50 feet. The observation to be made here is that in a small room, lot of light is absorbed by walls. When you have a large room, the emphasis would be to have good lighting on the work plane. Large rooms never locate lamps. In fact, the common mistake which is done is by placing lamps too low. It is not required. Remember, if you try creating a large source of light, it is independent of the distance from the lamp. Now, coming to the finish, we said the interior finish does affect, and in fact color reflectance affects utilization, and often white or off-white or yellow are preferred. The reflectance levels which one expects, you expect most of the light from the ceiling to be reflected onto the objects, whereas walls and the floor are expected normally to have very low reflectance. Walls have typically around 45 to 60%, where the floor has a least with 10 to 20%. Now, in fact, schools and offices have lower decorative kind of a thing, high end utilization. Now, an additional issue which comes is, how do we maintain? We design considering all this, come up with a situation, then comes the maintenance. There must be a regular definite maintenance. Periodic check could be by way of using light meters, and whenever there is a reduction by 20 to 25%, it's time to replace. Replacement individually may work at home, but not in large installations. It's preferable to do it in group. The source of depreciation in light output is luminaires. They collect the direct light. Therefore, after reflection, at least 1.5 times minimum requirement must be there. The other issue is the lamp survival, which depends on the voltage. If maintained properly, it will be good. Otherwise, energy costs go high. In case the voltage available is greater than the label voltage, the life is shortened. On the other hand, if the voltage is less than the label voltage, light output is low. No doubt energy costs may be low, but due to inefficient this thing, that may increase other costs. The lamps and luminaires need to be maintained, luminaires they could be washed, cleaned. In direct case there is less dirt, in indirect case there is more dirt, so there is more periodic requirements. This could be wiped with brush or dry cloth or damp cloth. Grease should be washed, and that is as far as the lamps, but the interior, that is the walls and ceiling, are preferably painted every 1.5 to 2 years to create. With all this, the offices interiors could have fluorescent lamps with direct or indirect luminaires. The dusty, smoky factory environments could have mercury vapor lamps with direct luminaire, and average factory could have a fluorescent direct. But remember, replace lamps when 70% of them have lost their life. So, you have group replacement there. In effect, what we have seen in this lecture is that good interior lighting is governed by intensity, that is ample to see clearly and distinctly, creating nearly uniform distribution, which is soft and well diffused light. Color, of course, depending on the purpose and taste, keeping the sources well above the plane of vision to avoid glare. Shadows are always required for accentuating the depth of the object, should not be apparent or dense. They need to be toned down, that is why they are called soft shadows. The general lighting is provided which controls to require to the suit psychological modes. The natural light or daily light illumination varies with the weather, time and season, therefore windows are accordingly designed. Window opening such that the minimum daylight illuminance is twice the artificial illumination sufficient for the required task. The location of lamps depends on the candle power, spacing allowable, height at which located, keeping in mind they should be clear of obstruction and provide the required distribution of light. Color reflectance from the interior affects the utilization, and interior lighting needs to be periodically checked and maintained. Whenever they reach their 70% of its life or illumination level falls below standard, say 20 to 25%, preferable to change. It is preferable to change lamps in groups rather than individually. The questions: what are the factors which need to be considered while designing interior lighting? Why are shadows important while designing interior lighting? What are the defects in interior lighting considering from the brightness point of view? What is the criteria for deciding the height of a window? Why is periodic check of the interior lamps required? Answer to questions of the previous lecture. What are primary colors? Primary colors are red, green and blue. What are the various color specification schemes we saw in the last lecture? Color specification schemes in vogue are Minsel system, CIE system and LAB color space. Continuing with the answers, what are the basic elements in color specification? The basic elements in a color specification are hue, value and chroma, that is 3-dimensional. What is a perceived color? The color that is perceived as object color, this is a result of the characteristics depending on the viewing direction and adaptation of the observer. What is CRI? CRI stands for the color rendering index. It is the property of making color appearance of objects under the source in question when compared to color under reference light conditions. Thank you.